Petrarch. Francesco Petrarca, Italian, July 20, 1304, July 18/19, 1374, commonly anglicized as Petrarch, /ഃpiːtrɑːrk, pt/, was an Italian scholar and poet during the early Italian Renaissance who was one of the earliest humanists. Petrarch's rediscovery of Cicero's letters is often credited with initiating the 14th-century Italian Renaissance and the founding of Renaissance humanism. In the 16th century, Pietro Bembo created the model for the modern Italian language based on Petrarch's works, as well as those of Giovanni Boccaccio, and, to a lesser extent, Dante Alighieri. Petrarch would be later endorsed as a model for Italian style by the Accademia della Crusca. Petrarch's sonnets were admired and imitated throughout Europe during the Renaissance and became a model for lyrical poetry. He is also known for being the first to develop the concept of the Dark Ages. Biography. Youth and early career. Petrarch was born in the Tuscan city of Arezzo July 20 in 1304. He was the son of Ser Petrarco and his wife Aletta Canigiani. His given name was Francesco Petrarca. The name was Latinized to Petrarca. Petrarch's younger brother was born in Incisa in Valdarno in 1307. Dante was a friend of his father. Petrarch spent his early childhood in the village of Incisa, near Florence. He spent much of his early life at Avignon and nearby Carpentras, where his family moved to follow Pope Clement V, who moved there in 1309 to begin the Avignon papacy. He studied law at the University of Montpellier, 1316-20, and Bologna, 1320-23, with a lifelong friend and schoolmate called Guido Set. Because his father was in the legal profession, a notary, he insisted that Petrarch and his brother study law also. Petrarch, however, was primarily interested in writing in Latin literature and considered these 7 years wasted. Additionally, he proclaimed that through legal manipulation his guardians robbed him of his small property inheritance in Florence, which only reinforced his dislike for the legal system. He protested, "I couldn't face making a merchandise of my mind," as he viewed the legal system as the art of selling justice. Petrarch was a prolific letter writer and counted Boccaccio among his notable friends to whom he wrote often. After the death of their parents, Petrarch and his brother Gherardo went back to Avignon in 1326, where he worked in numerous clerical offices. This work gave him much time to devote to his writing. With his first large-scale work, Africa, an epic in Latin about the great Roman general Scipio Africanus, Petrarch emerged as a European celebrity. On April 8, 1341, he became the second poet laureate since antiquity and was crowned by Roman senatori Giordano Orsini and Orso dell'Anguilla on the holy grounds of Rome's capital. He traveled widely in Europe, served as an ambassador, and, because he traveled for pleasure, as with his ascent of Mont Ventoux, has been called the first tourist. During his travels, he collected crumbling Latin manuscripts and was a prime mover in the recovery of knowledge from writers of Rome and Greece. He encouraged and advised Leontius Philetus's translation of Homer from a manuscript purchased by Boccaccio, although he was severely critical of the result. Petrarch had acquired a copy, which he did not entrust to Leontius, but he knew no Greek. Homer, Petrarch said, was dumb to him, while he was deaf to Homer. In 1345 he personally discovered a collection of Cicero's letters not previously known to have existed, the collection Epistolae ad Atticum, in the chapter library, Bibliotheca Capitolaire, of Verona Cathedral. Disdaining what he believed to be the ignorance of the centuries preceding the era in which he lived, Petrarch is credited or charged with creating the concept of a historical Dark Ages. Mount Ventoux. Petrarch recounts that on April 26, 1336, with his brother and 2 servants, he climbed to the top of Mont Ventoux, 1,912 meters, 6,273 feet, a feat which he undertook for recreation rather than necessity. The exploit is described in a celebrated letter addressed to his friend and confessor, the monk Dionigi di Borgo San Sepolcro, composed sometime after the fact. In it, Petrarch claimed to have been inspired by Philip V of Macedon's ascent of Mount Hemo and that an aged peasant had told him that nobody had ascended Ventoux before or after himself, 50 years before, and warned him against attempting to do so. The 19th century Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt noted that Jean Buridan had climbed the same mountain a few years before, and ascents accomplished during the Middle Ages have been recorded, including that of Anno II, Archbishop of Cologne. Scholars note that Petrarch's letter to Dionysi displays a strikingly modern attitude of aesthetic gratification in the grandeur of the scenery and is still often cited in books and journals devoted to the sport of mountaineering. In Petrarch, this attitude is coupled with an aspiration for a virtuous Christian life, and on reaching the summit, he took from his pocket a volume by his beloved mentor, St. Augustine, that he always carried with him. As the book fell open, Petrarch's eyes were immediately drawn to the following words. Petrarch's response was to turn from the outer world of nature to the inner world of soul. James Hillman argues that this rediscovery of the inner world is the real significance of the Ventoux event. The Renaissance begins not with the ascent of Mont Ventoux but with the subsequent descent, the return to the Valley of Soul, as Hillman puts it. Arguing against such a singular and hyperbolic periodization, Paul James suggests a different reading. Later years. Petrarch spent the later part of his life journeying through northern Italy as an international scholar and poet-diplomat. His career in the church did not allow him to marry, but he is believed to have fathered 2 children by a woman or women unknown to posterity. A son, Giovanni, was born in 1337, and a daughter, Francesca, was born in 1343. Both he later legitimized. Giovanni died of the plague in 1361. In the same year Petrarch was named canon in Monsalese near Padua. Francesca married Francescuolo da Bracciano, who was later named executor of Petrarch's will, that same year. In 1362, shortly after the birth of a daughter, Aletta, the same name as Petrarch's mother, they joined Petrarch in Venice to flee the plague then ravaging parts of Europe. A second grandchild, Francesco, was born in 1366, but died before his second birthday. Francesca and her family lived with Petrarch in Venice for 5 years from 1362 to 1367 at Palazzo Melina, although Petrarch continued to travel in those years. Between 1361 and 1369 the younger Boccaccio paid the older Petrarch 2 visits. The first was in Venice, the second was in Padua. About 1368 Petrarch and his daughter Francesca, with her family, moved to the small town of Arqua in the Euganean hills near Padua, where he passed his remaining years in religious contemplation. He died in his house in Arqua early on July 20, 1374, his 70th birthday. The house hosts now a permanent exhibition of Petrarchian works and curiosities. Among others you find the famous tomb of Petrarch's beloved cat who was embalmed. On the marble slab there is a Latin inscription written by Antonio Quarenghi. Petrarch's will, dated April 4, 1370, leaves 50 florins to Boccaccio to buy a warm winter dressing gown, various legacies, a horse, a silver cup, a lute, a Madonna, to his brother and his friends, his house in Vaucluse to its caretaker, for his soul, and for the poor, and the bulk of his estate to his son-in-law, Francescuolo da Bracciano, who is to give half of it to the person to whom, as he knows, I wish it to go, presumably his daughter, Francesca, Bracciano's wife. The will mentions neither the property in Arqua nor his library. Petrarch's library of notable manuscripts was already promised to Venice, in exchange for the Palazzo Melina. This arrangement was probably cancelled when he moved to Padua, the enemy of Venice, in 1368. The library was seized by the lords of Padua, and his books and manuscripts are now widely scattered over Europe. Nevertheless, the Bibliotheca Marciana traditionally claimed this bequest as its founding, although it was in fact founded by Cardinal Bessarion in 1468. Works. Petrarch is best known for his Italian poetry, notably the Canzoniere, songbook, and the Trionfi, triumphs. However, Petrarch was an enthusiastic Latin scholar and did most of his writing in this language. His Latin writings include scholarly works, introspective essays, letters, and more poetry. Among them are Secretum Meum, My Secret Book, an intensely personal, guilt-ridden imaginary dialogue with Augustine of Hippo, De Virici Lustribus, on famous men, a series of moral biographies, Rerum Memorandum Libri, an incomplete treatise on the cardinal virtues, De Otio Religiosorum, on religious leisure, and De Vita Solitaria, on the solitary life, which praise the contemplative life, De Remediis Utriusque Fortunae, Remedies for Fortune Fair and Foul, a self-help book which remained popular for hundreds of years, Itinerarium, Petrarch's Guide to the Holy Land, invectives against opponents such as doctors, scholastics, and the French, the Carmen Bucolicum, a collection of 12 pastoral poems, and the unfinished Epic Africa. He translated 7 psalms, a collection known as the Penitential Psalms. Petrarch also published many volumes of his letters, including a few written to his long-dead friends from history such as Cicero and Virgil. Cicero, Virgil, and Seneca were his literary models. Most of his Latin writings are difficult to find today, but several of his works are available in English translations. Several of his Latin works are scheduled to appear in the Harvard University Press series ʻpiːtrɑːrk. It is difficult to assign any precise dates to his writings because he tended to revise them throughout his life. Petrarch collected his letters into two major sets of books called Epistolae Familiares, Letters on Familiar Matters, and Seniles, Letters of Old Age, both of which are available in English translation. The plan for his letters was suggested to him by knowledge of Cicero's letters. These were published without names to protect the recipients, all of whom had close relationships to Petrarch. The recipients of these letters included Philippe de Capasoles, Bishop of Cavaillon, Ildebrandino Conti, Bishop of Padua, Cola di Rienzo, Tribune of Rome, Francesco Nelli, priest of the Prior of the Church of the Holy Apostles in Florence, and Nicola di Capoccia, a cardinal and priest of Saint Vitalis. His letter to posterity, the last letter in Seniles, gives an autobiography and a synopsis of his philosophy and life. It was originally written in Latin and was completed in 1371 or 1372, the first such autobiography in 1,000 years, since St. Augustine. While Petrarch's poetry was set to music frequently after his death, especially by Italian madrigal composers of the Renaissance in the 16th century, only one musical setting composed during Petrarch's lifetime survives. This is Non al suo amante by Jacopo de Bologna, written around 1350. Lore and Poetry. On April 6, 1327, after Petrarch gave up his vocation as a priest, the sight of a woman called Laura in the church of St. Claire d'Avignon awoke in him a lasting passion, celebrated in the rhyme sparse, scattered rhymes. Later, Renaissance poets who copied Petrarch's style named this collection of 366 poems Il Canzoniere, songbook. Laura may have been Laura de Noves, the wife of Count Hugues de Sade, an ancestor of the Marquess de Sade. There is little definite information in Petrarch's work concerning Laura, except that she is lovely to look at, fair-haired, with a modest, dignified bearing. Laura and Petrarch had little or no personal contact. According to his secretum, she refused him because she was already married. He channeled his feelings into love poems that were exclamatory rather than persuasive, and wrote prose that showed his contempt for men who pursue women. Upon her death in 1348, the poet found that his grief was as difficult to live with as was his former despair. Later in his letter to posterity, Petrarch wrote, "In my younger days I struggled constantly with an overwhelming but pure love affair, my only one, and I would have struggled with it longer had not premature death, bitter but salutary for me, extinguished the cooling flames." I certainly wish I could say that I have always been entirely free from desires of the flesh, but I would be lying if I did. While it is possible she was an idealized or pseudonymous character, particularly since the name Laura has a linguistic connection to the poetic laurels Petrarch coveted, Petrarch himself always denied it. His frequent use of Laura is also remarkable. For example, the line Erano I cape d'oro a Laura sparsi may both mean her hair was all over Laura's body, and the wind, Laura, blew through her hair. There is psychological realism in the description of Laura, although Petrarch draws heavily on conventionalized descriptions of love and lovers from troubadour songs and other literature of courtly love. Her presence causes him unspeakable joy, but his unrequited love creates unendurable desires, inner conflicts between the ardent lover and the mystic Christian, making it impossible to reconcile the two. Petrarch's quest for love leads to hopelessness and irreconcilable anguish, as he expresses in the series of paradoxes in Rima 134 Pace non trovo, et non ho grave de fargera /e timo, et spero, et ardo, et sun un ghiaccio, I find no peace, and yet I make no war /and fear, and hope, and burn, and I am ice. Laura is unreachable, the few physical descriptions of her are vague, almost impalpable as the love he pines for, and such is perhaps the power of his verse, which lives off the melodies it evokes against the fading, diaphanous image that is no more consistent than a ghost. Francesco de Sanctis remarks much the same thing in his Storia della letteratura italiana, and contemporary critics agree on the powerful music of his verse. Perhaps the poet was inspired by a famous singer he met in Veneto around the 1350s. Gianfranco Contini, in a famous essay on Petrarch's language, Preliminary sulla lingua del Petrarca. Petrarca, Canzoniere. Turin, Einaudi, 1964, has spoken of linguistic indeterminacy. Petrarch never rises above the bel pied, her lovely foot. Laura is too holy to be painted, she is an awe-inspiring goddess. Sensuality and passion are suggested rather by the rhythm and music that shape the vague contours of the lady. In addition, some today consider Laura to be a representation of an ideal Renaissance woman, based on her nature and definitive characteristics. Sonnet 227. Dante. Petrarch is a world apart from Dante and his Divina Commedia. In spite of the metaphysical subject, the Commedia is deeply rooted in the cultural and social milieu of turn-of-the-century Florence, Dante's rise to power, 1300, and exile, 1302. His political passions call for a violent use of language, where he uses all the registers, from low and trivial to sublime and philosophical. Petrarch confessed to Boccaccio that he had never read the Commedia, remarks Contini, wondering whether this was true or Petrarch wanted to distance himself from Dante. Dante's language evolves as he grows old, from the courtly love of his early still novistic rhyme in Vita Nuova to the Convivio and Divina Commedia, where Beatrice is sanctified as the goddess of philosophy, the philosophy announced by the Donna Gentile at the death of Beatrice. In contrast, Petrarch's thought and style are relatively uniform throughout his life. He spent much of it revising the songs and sonnets of the canzoniere rather than moving to new subjects or poetry. Here, poetry alone provides a consolation for personal grief, much less philosophy or politics, as in Dante, for Petrarch fights within himself, sensuality versus mysticism, profane versus Christian literature, not against anything outside of himself. The strong moral and political convictions which had inspired Dante belonged to the Middle Ages and the libertarian spirit of the Commune. Petrarch's moral dilemmas, his refusal to take a stand in politics, his reclusive life point to a different direction, or time. The Free Commune, the place that had made Dante an eminent politician and scholar, was being dismantled, the Signoria was taking its place. Humanism and its spirit of empirical inquiry, however, were making progress, but the papacy, especially after Avignon, and the Empire, Henry VII, the last hope of the White Guelphs, died near Siena in 1313, had lost much of their original prestige. Petrarch polished and perfected the sonnet form inherited from Giacomo da Lentini, in which Dante widely used in his Vita Nuova to popularize the new courtly love of the dolce stil novo. The tercet benefits from Dante's terza rima. Compare the Divina Commedia. The quatrains prefer the abba to the abab scheme of the Sicilians. The imperfect rhymes of you with closed o and I with closed e, inherited from Gidone's mistaken rendering of Sicilian verse, are excluded, but the rhyme of open and closed o is kept. Finally, Petrarch's enjambment creates longer semantic units by connecting one line to the following. The vast majority, 317, of Petrarch's 366 poems collected in the Canzoniere, dedicated to Laura, were sonnets, and the Petrarchan sonnet still bears his name. Philosophy. Petrarch is traditionally called the father of humanism and considered by many to be the father of the Renaissance. In his work Secretum Meum he points out that secular achievements did not necessarily preclude an authentic relationship with God. Petrarch argued instead that God had given humans their vast intellectual and creative potential to be used to their fullest. He inspired humanist philosophy which led to the intellectual flowering of the Renaissance. He believed in the immense moral and practical value of the study of ancient history and literature, that is, the study of human thought and action. Petrarch was a devout Catholic and did not see a conflict between realizing humanity's potential and having religious faith. A highly introspective man, he shaped the nascent humanist movement a great deal because many of the internal conflicts and musings expressed in his writings were seized upon by Renaissance humanist philosophers and argued continually for the next 200 years. For example, Petrarch struggled with the proper relation between the active and contemplative life, and tended to emphasize the importance of solitude and study. In a clear disagreement with Dante, in 1346 Petrarch argued in his De Vita Solitaria that Pope Celestine V's refusal of the papacy in 1294 was as a virtuous example of solitary life. Later the politician and thinker Leonardo Bruni, 1370–1444, argued for the active life, or civic humanism. As a result, a number of political, military, and religious leaders during the Renaissance were inculcated with the notion that their pursuit of personal fulfillment should be grounded in classical example and philosophical contemplation. Legacy. Petrarch's influence is evident in the works of Serafino Simonelli from Aquila, 1466–1500, and in the works of Marindrsic, 1508–1567, from Dubrovnik. The Romantic composer Franz Liszt set 3 of Petrarch's sonnets, 47, 104, and 123, to music for voice, Tre sonetti del Petrarca, which he later would transcribe for solo piano for inclusion in the suite Onade de Pèlerinage. Liszt also set a poem by Victor Hugo, Au Congé d'Ors, in which Petrarch and Laura are invoked as the epitome of erotic love. While in Avignon in 1991, modernist composer Elliott Carter completed his solo flute piece Scrivo Invento, which is in part inspired by and structured by Petrarch's Sonnet 212, Beato in Sogno. It was premiered on Petrarch's 687th birthday. In November 2003, it was announced that pathological anatomists would be exhuming Petrarch's body from his casket in Aqua Petrarca, in order to verify 19th-century reports that he had stood 1.83 meters, about 6 feet, which would have been tall for his period. The team from the University of Padua also hoped to reconstruct his cranium in order to generate a computerized image of his features to coincide with his 700th birthday. The tomb had been opened previously in 1873 by Professor Giovanni Canestrini, also of Padua University. When the tomb was opened, the skull was discovered in fragments, and a DNA test revealed that the skull was not Petrarch's, prompting calls for the return of Petrarch's skull. The researchers are fairly certain that the body in the tomb is Petrarch's due to the fact that the skeleton bears evidence of injuries mentioned by Petrarch in his writings, including a kick from a donkey when he was 42. Works in English translation 42. Works in English translation 42. Works in English translation 42.